Hello, how are you? I'd like to start off by telling you a little story that my mom told me throughout my entire childhood. It was about a specific day that quite literally changed the very trajectory of her life. Started out, though, not unlike any day. Her father, though, on that particular day, received a visit from a white man, someone she knew. It was a familiar face. But on this day, something different happened. On this day, she noticed that the conversation between these two men got a little bit more heated than normal, and then she heard it. Her father's voice rose up, bold and resolute, yet calm and firm, when he said quite matter-of-factly, "I didn't raise any daughters to work in a white man's kitchen." With that, the two men parted, and my mother's path to leadership began. It's certainly true that as 21st century Black women, we have infinitely more choices and more opportunities than were afforded our mothers and our grandmothers, and certainly those who came generations before. But as much as things have changed over the years, other things have remained the same. And if there's one thing that has been stunningly consistent when we talk about the experience of Black women in America, it is this: Black women work. It didn't take a woman's movement to infuse us into America's labor market. We've been here all along, haven't we? And it's here we remain. To this very day, we are still more likely than any other women in America to work, And so we are committed to that. But despite our drive, despite our determination, despite our loyalty to America's labor market, the fact of the matter is it seems to be distinctly difficult for us to be able to traverse a path to leadership. Why is that? It's not because we don't want it. There's been significant research around this. McKinsey & Company and others have found that, in fact, Black women are the most ambitious demographic group in America. We're more likely than anyone else to want that next promotion. And we don't want it to be given to us. We are willing to put in the work to earn it. So it's not an issue of us not leaning in. Not at all. It's about us being shut out. There's been some other work that's been done by the Center on Talent Innovation, which found that Black women enter the workforce already as seasoned leaders. We are some twice as likely as our white female counterparts to have experience leading in our communities. We do things like start youth organizations, lead community service organizations. We're more likely to be sort of the head of the school board, for example. And we know we come from a history of leading and being the critical engines of change in movements that have quite literally transformed the world. So we know how to lead. That's a given. But something strange happens when we enter the workforce. It seems that in those spaces, our leadership potential and specific experience, our credentials, our work ethic, our commitment, all of that seems to somehow disappear. Some research has actually shown that Black women are more likely than any other demographic group to say that we can go our entire careers without having any senior leadership individuals within our organization specifically provide us any insight, any assistance, any help in being able to traverse a path to leadership ourselves. So what's going on here? I think what happens at the end of the day is that we have a unique experience of being especially likely of not having our aspirations and our abilities meet opportunity. And one of the ways in which that is especially evidenced is through something that I call the, ambition gap. What we find is that Black women are actually almost 3 times more likely to aspire to leadership than our white counterparts. But when it comes to who actually receives those opportunities, very different stories unfold. White women are, in fact, about 25% of those individuals who ultimately achieve senior executive positions, even though only 8% of white women eventually say that they aspire to those positions. Now, when we look at the experiences of Black women, we see that just 2% of us actually achieve senior executive positions, even though fully 22% of us say that's ultimately where we want to end up. Now, I don't know about you, but is something really wrong with that picture to me? It's telling me that we as a nation are leaving countless levels of ability, of hard work, of brilliance completely on the table and never tapped. And when we look at the ultimate level of leadership, being a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, we know that in those situations, this problem is really magnified. So specifically, if we look at the experience of white women, we know that in the year 2000, just 4 had achieved the position of CEO of a Fortune 500 company. By 2017, actually a record was reached. Fully 30 had achieved that position. Now, I will be the first to say that even 30 is not enough. When you think about the hundreds of white men in that position, this is vast underrepresentation. I'll be the first one to say that. But I would also say that the line is going in the right direction. There's a positive trend going on here. There's an increase in that representation over the years, and it's been accelerated in recent years. But what we've seen as it relates to the experiences of people of color is that that trend is going exactly in the opposite direction. And specifically as it relates to Black CEOs, we know that we've gone from a high of 12, now down to only 3. And we've seen similar declines among other people of color. So much so that as it stands today, the representation of white women as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies now eclipses that of all people of color of both genders combined. So what's going on here is really disturbing to see. Let's take a look, though, specifically at the situation that's experienced by women of color. We know that as it relates to women of color today, there are 2 who hold the position of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. But when we look specifically at the circumstances of Black women, in the entire 60-year history of the Fortune 500 CEO list, we know there's only been 1 Black woman to achieve that, Ursula Burns. And since she has now transitioned out of Xerox, that number has gone back to 0. You know, there is something stunningly wrong with this particular picture. I find it very interesting that we find ourselves at this place, even in a moment in which most companies will tell you that they value diversity. Most companies will tell you that they understand how important diversity is. They'll tell you the fact that to have diversity represented in their company means that you have more creativity. It means that you have more innovation. It means that that actually leads to more profits. There is an economic imperative for diversity. Yet we still see these numbers. So it's interesting to see how it's actually being played out. What we found in terms of the latest research on how companies are actually approaching diversity is that companies are tending to preference gender diversity over racial diversity, even though they're both extremely important. And what's particularly ironic is that this is happening specifically at a moment in which we all know that we're undergoing a huge demographic shift in this nation. As I stand before you right now, the majority of babies born in America are babies of color. So precisely when we are experiencing a moment in which this nation is getting browner and browner, at this time, the leadership structures within this nation are getting whiter and whiter, specifically going in the opposite direction. So what does all this mean? It means that you end up with situations like this one. What happened here, I don't know if you remember this photo, but a few years ago, an editor of a major publication tweeted this out to the world, super proud of herself, that she had an entirely female team. Yay! She was happy until it went viral. when people noticed that her entirely female team was also devoid of any women of color. Here's what I know for sure. Companies have taken an approach to gender diversity that tends to be very individualized in its attention. It tends to create a sense of gender diversity that somehow pushes out women of color. And what I also know is that gender diversity needs to be representative of women of color. And if that diversity does not include women who look like me, then guess what? That's not gender diversity at all. Thank you.